All right, well, let's get started. It might just be the 6 of us. We'll see how this all goes. I'm assuming if more people will show up. We're just figuring out how all of this works. But we don't actually want to have lots and lots of people in conversations, right? Our goal is not to have 30 people in conversations. And so normally what we are going to do is sort of start with people checking in on a text of sort of in the chat. I wonder if we just, since there's just 4 of you, I wonder if we just talk this through as opposed to doing it in the text. So this conversation's going to be focused on looking out into the future and saying, if we were in a world without gender-based violence, what would that look like? And then how would we predict the kind of macroeconomic trends in that world that would then be relevant to investors? And so that's going to be the kind of arc of the conversation, is to think a little bit about what that future looks like. Is it possible? You know, what does that actually look like? Is it possible? Then what's the connection between finance and futures? Like, why does finance need a future? How does that connect? And then how could we translate this into financing the reduction of gender-based violence if we had that future picture? But before we do that, I want to start with our acknowledgement that we're doing in each conversation. We did on the first one, and we're continuing this as a practice for each one. So lift your hands off the keyboard, hands up, and sort of no more clicking just for a minute. And just grab your own hand. Sort of, you've already got that, so welcome, Sarah. So practice here is to start by saying we're not alone. We have power in our hands. But this is not a light topic. And in this conversation, we will intellectualize and abstract a set of very real experiences. And these discussions might trigger a wide range of emotions. In this room, statistically, no matter how it's small, are many survivors of gender-based violence. And we all participate in political, social, cultural, and economic systems that give permission for and facilitate violence. In fact, violence kills more women between the ages of 15 and 44 than cancer, malaria, traffic accidents, and war combined. And yet in India, less than 1% of survivors reported gender-based violence to formal sources. So a moment of silence to acknowledge the violence happening in this precise moment to someone, somewhere. Now reverse your hands. So flip them so you're holding the other way, and notice the difference. Right? What changes when you change how you're holding your hands? We've come together to create new possibilities to address the epidemic of violence in our world, and connected in new ways, we can do even more. So let us begin. So with that grounding in our morning, why don't we start with a positive question of, and I love that Sarah's trying to get on the call, I'm guessing, but she's actually from Futures Without Violence. So it's great that she's joining this because she can talk to this very question of, is it possible? Right? Maybe let's start with that question, because I think one of the things I've learned so much in conversations with Sarah over the years and others is even the importance of naming that it's possible versus it will be with us always. So I'm curious where you all enter into that conversation. Is ending gender-based violence possible? What say you?
This is Sierra. I would say yes, it is possible with prevention and social change, but I think that would take many generations to actually change the norms of society. So it's not like a few-year approach, it would be many generations.
Right, it's not some like Gates challenge that if they put out $1 million for a year, we can make it, right, no.
Yeah,
so,
and prevention is key with
so
it.
prevention is key, right.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, you mean just to kind of get, because that's code for all kinds of stuff, right? So what do you mean by that?
Prevention programs, and then again, tying into that social norms piece of prevention programs, things like that.
Right, cool. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think education is key.
Is it possible though? So if education is key, perhaps, but what is it actually possible?
Yeah, I think it's possible. You've seen changes in the way they are teaching math from our parents to ours to our kids. So they could do it. We could do it. We could educate kids in a different ways. You have to educate the teachers, the coaches, the parents, but education is really a key entry point.
Gotcha. Other thoughts? Dunya?
I believe it's possible. Just seeing my mother, my grandmother, how they were treated, how I'm treated, the opportunities that I have that they didn't have, and the voice that I have that they didn't have, gives me a lot of hope. And so in that, I'm grounded in experience and knowing that it's possible at in my microcosm, so I can see how it's possible in society at large. Plus, I believe everything is possible. But I really like that you started with the silence, because a piece of this is that this is a topic that's very silenced, and we as women are taught, and gender-based is not only women, but I am speaking from that lens. I associate it very, very much to women empowerment and this notion of having a voice and the agency that comes with that. And I hear more and more women voice. So that's another thing that makes me feel like this.
Those are tied to the education and prevention, and the social norms piece is the question of voice, which, Sierra, I'm assuming is part of that sort of prevention story you're telling. Rose, how about you? And welcome, Sarah.
I want to think it's possible, but I know for sure it is impossible in my context. And this is why. Gender-based violence, and especially if you add sexual gender-based violence in my context, is also camouflaged and hidden in long-standing cultural practices and taboos. So to free the women, to free the world in a patriarchal society where men hold power, and not be able to break the cultural barriers and the taboos that women are put on to go through, then that world is imaginary, because in my context, people live by their culture. People don't even live by laws and constitution. People first belong to their culture, and then they belong to the nation. And sometimes when I talk to my friends, I tell them there's no country called Kenya. Kenya is a bunch of tribes put together. So for that reason, it would take, what would it take for that to happen? It may take education, it will take economic empowerment. Particularly, I really believe it would take economic empowerment, and then educating the women, but also changing men's attitude and behavior towards women. Men who have always known women are beneath. Women must be, they should be widows, particularly that I work with, and I'm a widow myself. I'm a lived story of widowhood, is that women should be seen and not heard. Worse still, if women don't have children. In my case, I'm a childless widow of the post-election violence in Kenya in 2008. So that makes the barriers, the cultural barriers, even triple, where women who have children hold more power and voice, more so if they have sons. So in my context, it's a world that is imaginary, it's a Wakanda world. But what will change that for women like me is first empowerment, educating them, and putting resources and opportunities in their hands so that they can understand what are rights, because these are women who never went to school. Women were never taken to school before. So even if I'm a widow, I'm the most privileged of them all. I'm the one who my mother took me to school. My parents were teachers. So I still recognize my privilege and miss them. So ordinarily, women like me would not even be in this space. Women that I support and work with, 8,000 of them wouldn't be in this space. They wouldn't be included. They wouldn't be heard, even in a council meeting. So changing attitudes and behavior, creating opportunities for them, and putting resources in their hand, because these are the most resilient women I know. COVID has proved to be a widow-making machine. So these are women who are surviving 2 pandemics. They survived HIV and AIDS, and now they are surviving COVID-19. So perhaps if you go back to our last conversation, they are the real experts. So if we are able to put resources and opportunities to them, then we can trust as they have endured and maybe dream of the Wakanda gender-based free world, then that would be their world.
So welcome, Sarah. We started a conversation that I know is dear to your heart, which is it possible to end gender-based violence?
Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm so sorry to be late. I have to say this is now my 5th call this morning, and so far it's already my favorite, but that's the question of the day. But so good to meet everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm with an organization called Futures Without Violence. I'm based in the United States in New York. Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer is yes. And I so enjoyed, Rosaline, it was so great to hear your thoughts as well, and I couldn't agree more, particularly around the whole woman, the whole child, that this isn't just a health issue, it's social norms, it's economic justice, it's racial justice, particularly in the context that I work in. In the United States, there's been a 65% drop in rates of intimate partner violence prior to COVID-19. That's an average number, and that's of course deceptive, because if you disaggregate that by race, rates for African American and Black women in this country are 35% higher than white women, for instance. But on par, there's been a drop. That's changing now in the context of COVID-19, as we've seen spikes across the country. But for us, and the organization that I'm with, the answer is yes. And we believe also there's evidence to show that it can change. And for us, one of the biggest breakthroughs we've seen in terms of answering that question of how to prevent gender-based violence has also been grounded in work with kids and childhood trauma, particularly the neuroscience that's come out in the past 15 years around kids who are exposed to violence. We know violence is a learned behavior, but we also know that experiencing or witnessing violence from birth to 5 years old leaves epigenetic imprints. So how the brain develops after experiencing that extreme trauma affects how a kid develops, and it affects their stress responses as they grow up. So I think for us too, this is an intergenerational story. It's a story about supporting families early on, as well as empowering women and supporting and lifting up women. But for me, one of the greatest privileges that I have is entering this movement when I did 25 years ago, at a time when the solutions are there. Like, we've seen it happen, the solutions are there, it can change. And now I think it's about the will and the movement coming together to really make it happen. So anyways, it's a real privilege to be with all of you today. And like I said, already my favorite meeting based on the topic. So yay!
Carolyn, do you want to weigh in on this? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a tough subject to tackle because there's so many different facets, and people experience violence in different ways. I think broadly, yes, it's possible. I think there's been a real awakening about, Me Too and enough is enough. Like, we're not going to put up with this as individuals or a society. we hold ourselves to these values and we're not seeing those results come into play. But I think on a more interesting and personal level, in my country of Canada, we've had a really long history with violence against Indigenous peoples, and particularly women, Indigenous people. And I think there's a real awakening now about, again, enough is enough. And we're going to put resources, as you said, into specifically programs cater towards the needs of Indigenous women. We're going to put cultural changes out there. So we're now doing land acknowledgements. We're doing proper terminology. We're giving back streets in the capital city to the people that owned it originally, and giving them a place in our society as opposed to taking over theirs. But I think because it's that willingness, we're at a place where almost everybody feels victimized now in one way or another. And I think that sense of personalism has now been equated with, I wouldn't want anyone else to feel that way, so why would I do something that would be harmful to others? And that moment in time is really helping to kind of project a future where I think it is less violent. I think that there's a real desire to build more peace. So looking forward to seeing greater changes ahead.
So in the kind of arc of this conversation, there's a piece of this that is, and part of the overall, the point of Convergence, what we're working on collectively. And I find it, I think it's interesting. I'm sort of checking who in this conversation was from the finance world, who interestingly took a pass on the future. No, that's not right. That's not fair. Very great people from finance showing up in this overall conversation, but not so much on this call, right? Anybody on this call really grounded in finance? Celine, are you magically a finance person within this? All right, so we get to have a very safe conversation that's just about us talking about what this all means in the context of finance. And one of the things that that sort of started early 2 years ago when we were working on the sort of idea of financing the reduction of gender-based violence and what role should finance play. Many different themes, and as you go through the next couple weeks, there'll be lots of different angles and lots of different solutions, and how do we actually finance things like education programs, like many, many, many different approaches. But one of the challenges that we had in having the conversation was that gender-based violence is seen as chronic, and if something, it's chronic, or what's described as a systemic risk, right? It kind of exists in the world, it's part of the world, but if it's not changing, there is an angle. One angle of how to look at how finance engages is that they need to see a future that they're betting on or not. Right? And one of the challenges in this conversation has been that dynamic of this is what it is today, but what might it look like in the future? Just because nobody makes money in the present, right? We're asking a few of the sort of really creative finance people in this gathering to actually have a panel, just a conversation, not a panel, a conversation about why finance needs a future. And part of it is because you're tracking trends out into the future. And as you're doing that, if people can't see change, there's a set of strategies go off the table. It's not that there's nothing to be done, but there's a set of strategies that is much harder for people in finance. So maybe for the point of today, I would love to wrestle with, because I think what I'm struck by even listening to your first conversation, the first set of conversations, is each of you said it's possible if these things happen. Right, so that we need culture change, we need education. So it's possible if. Maybe we could flip to if, trying to figure out where to take, if we were in that future, what would be different? Because part of it is without painting a picture of a future, it's really hard to have conversations with people. Like climate change, just to play this out, climate change has a future. It's a negative one. It says out in this future, here is this reality. And if we can't paint a point that says this is what it looks like as the reduction of gender-based violence happens, or when the reduction of gender-based happens, or as it happens, if we can't paint that picture, we're sort of stuck with people just saying, well, we'll work around it, right? We'll figure out how to, just recognize the risks and try to support people who experience it, but not sort of have a sense that, sort of building on your comment, Carolyn, that if attitudes changed, like we started to see within, Me Too, if those attitudes started to change, what would happen? So maybe just find your way into that conversation someplace. Let's see where this goes for a while.
I think one of you mentioned power. So I think that in the future, if there is no more gender-based violence, it means that the power will be more balanced. If power is more balanced, maybe sons and boys and men have been raised in a different way, so they are not raised to be warriors. So maybe there will be less wars, but then there will be less guns and arms sold, which comes to the idea we're talking about finance, but I think that if we want gender-based violence to be eradicated, we need money. And so at a state level, this money can come from the army budget, for instance, just to close the loop. But I don't think people would bet on that. But
Other thoughts?
When I was listening to Celine, what I was seeing is raising boys differently and men, and what came was this notion of emotional intelligence, and we're not taught how to feel, to understand what we're feeling and to hold what we're feeling for what it is, and attention on the body. I think power, it's radically, because it's a lot about where we put our attention, and so there's this reclaiming of our emotions and caring, and that we all hold feminine and masculine. So this whole thing of gender also becomes way more fluid, and that these attributes of being strong is not men or women, that it's something that we all cultivate, and that strength can be very soft as well. Mm-hmm. So, and then with that, the image that comes with me is becoming stewards of the earth and of each other. So there's that love and care that replaces the abyss of violence.
Right. Rose?
I like Celine's and Dunia's. I think maybe also it's teaching girls how to own up power, that being aggressive is not being allowed and being disrespectful. Also teaching girls to own up to standing tall and owning certain spaces, because women were cultured to raise girls lower, and so girls are raised to also go lower and not higher. So I think it's working both ways, training girls, women and girls, dream higher, dream bigger, be louder, be present, be invisible. And when you show up and you're too loud, you are always problematic, when you challenge an issue, you are causing bad trouble. So teaching women and girls that owning up is also not challenging power, but also claiming that space for gender equality.
Other thoughts? Sarah?
Yeah, so I wasn't able to hear Rose. Were you able to hear?
I could hear most of it.
Okay.
So
Okay, that's great.
yeah.
Okay.
So Rose, do you want to do it again? You were saying that girls could also be aggressive.
I was saying
We can
that,
figure out.
sorry.
Oh, lean in. It's actually better. That's maybe what we need. That's a little better.
Okay, I hope it's clearer now. I have some people there helping me, but they are unwell. I think it's also training girls to also own up to the space, because girls are trained that women already are trained that if you are loud enough and you are problematic and you are causing trouble, then you are challenging the status quo. So retraining girls to be more aggressive, be more positions that require a woman to stand up is also going to show that it is not only a women issue, but it's good for everybody. It's good for both men and boys, but it's also good for women and girls.
Could you hear me?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Rose. Yeah, I agree. I think I would add to that. Okay, honey. I think I would add, for me, a future without violence, at least in the context that I live and work, is less about individual family change and more about deeper systems change. Like I live in a deeply racist system of haves and have-nots. And there's benefits to this system to perpetuate gender inequalities. There's benefits to sexist practices. There's benefits to keeping women out of areas of the economy. There's benefits to racism, right, in the system that I live in. And so I think a future without violence is also a dramatic change in the systems that we live and work in. I think it's no longer a system of, like a punitive system of punishing, for instance, men who use violence. I think it's a system about healing from trauma. The people who experience violence in their homes are most deeply traumatized at an early age from these systems, right? Nothing is innate about this. It's behaviors that are being caused by the system that we live in. So for me, a future without violence is a radically different type of system and environment that we work in. And I guess, Joy, your role and your Criterion's role in kind of bringing together financial systems and markets and the relationship and perhaps tool in ending gender-based violence is why this is so powerful, because those systems and capitalism in particular has a direct benefit the way it's currently designed. Mm-hmm. It benefits off of it. There is market value to some of these things. That's why I so appreciated Criterion's leadership on this and bringing those two pieces together. But I think that part of the future is at that intersection of these two discussions. So. I'm sorry, you're going to see my kids at various points pop in because I'm doing remote keeping as I do this too. So sorry in advance.
No apologies necessary. Sierra, do you want to weigh in, or I'll keep? No, you're all good. So I wonder if we can shift a little bit and say, because I think what I'm taking from this sort of first bit of a conversation, and what I'm taking, and just my part of it is I don't want to just be the voice of finance, and so I wish that some of the folks who are in the finance side are showing up. I wish we could merge this conversation with last night's conversation where we had like 10 public equity people sitting on a conversation. So, but you know what? This is the conversation that's meant to be, and so I am going to fully celebrate it, and I actually think there's something useful in this. And so there's amazing things that are useful in this. Even though the finance people aren't here, I think the piece that I'm taking from this first arc of the conversation, because I often am in a room and people say to me, well, if gender-based violence is shifting, or if it could end, or if there was a possibility of a future without gender-based violence, how would that affect various sectors? And how would that play out in my investments? And all of those kinds of questions then become the if this, then that. I do think you're saying something deeper in each of your comments, which is and maybe this is just my figuring something out, which is that the future without gender-based violence is the same as the process of getting to a future without gender-based violence, right? So what each of you said is it's about shifting cultural norms. If the cultural norms shifted, that's what's going to end gender-based violence. But you would have to have shifted cultural norms, and so what would be different in the future is gender norms and cultural norms would be different, right? Power dynamics would be different. And so the path, Celine, your first comment of like, because when you were all first answering, I was like, oh no, you're describing how we would get there, not what it would look like if we got there, right? But in fact, I think what I'm taking away from this, just, I don't know, it's messing with my head a little bit, is there isn't actually a different picture of the future. The picture of the future is what would need to change to get to that future. Am I here? Welcome, Rachel. Good. It's very early for you this morning, so congratulations on getting up at the 30s. But
good morning. I'm sorry I'm late. I had to take my husband to work because I'm still battling air quality issues. He normally bikes, but I needed to give him a ride this morning. So sorry I'm late.
No problem, Rachel. So we'll give you a moment to settle in, and then. But what do you think about that? Is that, Sierra? You were nodding a little bit. Is that making sense to you?
Yeah, no, I think that was a great way to sum it up. It seems like the process to get there would be the same thing as like when you actually get there, and I guess it's kind of like you just have to maintain that process once you're actually there, maybe.
Right, and so maybe one of the questions is, which is what each of you also named at some point, of the process to the possibility of that future is in part about the resources and the will to get to that future, right? Because part of the other challenges we would need to change to get to that future, the sort of shift in, all right, now I'm gonna not get to that point very clearly. There's something about, I'm sort of in that chicken or the egg problem, right? You would have to then have people valuing that change and upending the power dynamics and Rose, to your point, who has resources and who has that access to resources, who's at the table to upend the other pieces. So maybe we're just in a constant chicken or an egg problem. Dunya, you have a way out of this for us?
Rosalind, did you want to go?
Mm-hmm. Just a quick one. I agree with the process. Is what looks like the end. Because
okay, step a little bit more. Come more into the computer. We so all want to hear you. So
the process to get there is as important as the end. So the process is what is missing, particularly if you look at grassroots development, is that everything else is centered around cities and capitals and towns and everybody else in the grassroots is left out. So if that process is not inclusive of the masses and millions of women who are literally left on their own at the grassroots, then just a few of us sitting at the table and millions of us outside, then that imaginary gender-free world does not include every woman. And then therefore it will not benefit all of us. If all of us are not in it, then few of us in it are also endangered.
There was a piece of that was at the end that was really critical, and I missed a couple words. I don't know about the rest of you, but you named the imaginary future, which I love that, of like, in this imaginary future, if not all of us are there. Can you just say that piece again?
If all of us are not there, then those of us who are there, then they're also at risk, because if 1 millionaire in a village of 4 millionaires who are not capable, who are living in abject poverty, then that 1 millionaire is in danger of attack from the 4 millions left out.
Right. Right.
So at the grassroots level, thousands and thousands of women across Africa are not in that imaginary space. They're not even in that process. They're not included in the process in the first place. So let's begin by including them as Criterion narrows up. And I've told you, Joy, many, many times, your role as Criterion is key here. Bringing voices like myself onto these spaces is maybe a first of many, unimaginable future, great future. So opening the process is itself a starting point, and then including more voices, including women who would never be at the table. And then making all of us then say, how then can we do it? What have we been missing? What can we include? What do you know that we don't know?
Yeah, Dunya.
I'm loving this. I'm sorry, I'm very like.
No, I know. It just looks like she just had a quick little thought that was then.
Yeah. But which is wonderful, because what I was thinking, what I wanted to share was, I really believe this process is non-linear. It's not like we need. It's the way it builds is that by having these women at the table, then it's like a movement. It scales in a way that's because if I see a woman that I relate to and she's standing up and she's owning her dream, then I see, oh, I can own my dream too. And the more and more we see women that from our villages, from our towns, then I feel like the effect is exponential. And so that's where getting there and being there is the same in some ways, which I love that has come up. And I love, Rosalind, that you are bringing up the dreaming. And part of the education piece was women be loud and own the dream that we have for so long. It's like, no, I can't, I'm not allowed to do that. And this idea also of bringing the margins to the center.
Rachel, do you want to wander into this delightful conversation we're having on a Friday morning? Afternoon, sorry, Rose. And Celine, we're all in very many different time zones trying to remember it on any given day. Last night it was afternoon, morning, and the middle of the night. So sorry, Rachel.
I guess one thing that's coming to mind just from our work on domestic violence and some of the kind of recent insights we've been having about how to break that cycle, part of what we're thinking about it from a multi-generational standpoint. So I think this both like poverty and violence are cyclical in many ways, and they're like both opportunity. You can break it and you can continue in it cycle. So we've been thinking about like how to really solve at a multi-generational scale, like in families and supporting healing from violence. And the other piece has been really thinking about the role of men in gender-based violence and how to really engage men and also support their healing processes. I mean, when we know from some of our life course analysis that, men who are victims of violence as children and women, go on to perpetrate violence or become victims of violence themselves. So that's part of the cycle that we're thinking about. So some of our newer work is thinking about, how do we more fully engage men? And then of course there's all this work around masculinity. What are how can we kind of remake masculinity, and so that to give freedom, to men too, to sort of to shift the way that they, are in their bodies and in our world. So I think those are just two insights. This is a very early morning, just sharing two thoughts about our work about like what it would take to break a multi-generational cycle and the role of men and in that.
I have a possible idea. I have no idea if this is going to work, but you roll along with me for a second. And what I want to think about, because I think what you're holding the space for is this sort of, I don't know if feminist is the right word, but a kind of space in which the sort of at the center is the, I think Dunia said it so well, of like where the getting there and being there is the same thing, right? So if getting there and being there in this future moment, this imaginary moment that for that imaginary moment to happen, and Rose, I think you are saying this so incredibly clearly, that for that imaginary moment to happen, we're really talking about a deeper level of change for everybody, not just some people. Like, this is the problem with Me Too, right? Me Too sort of tells the story of if you are in the media, on stage, and getting lots of attention, people will care about whether or not you're experiencing gender-based violence and sexual harassment at work, and they'll care about it in a certain way, right? That didn't spark a concern about the level of gender-based violence happening in agriculture, for example, right? It sort of stayed at we're concerned about one set of folks, and you could say, and this is just, I'm just naming where I hear this conversation going, and then I did have an idea just now, just processing where I'm going, that naming that, which I do often, and I think I might stop, that sort of naming Me Too as a kind of indicator that cultural norms are shifting from any broader lens is not shifting enough for us to actually be changing the situation, right? It's just, that there was so much sort of racism and sort of class built into how Me Too got framed in terms of who should not experience violence and what we are not tolerating, that it isn't necessarily I'll leave on that one. But you're holding this space for like getting there and being there are the same. We have to look holistically at how we're changing power dynamics. It needs to be about the change of the gender norms. And Rachel, you just jumped right in with as people were saying before you came on, it's about men's role and women's role and changing gender norms. So if all of that is happening, what I'd love for you to do is hold the space for that sort of lovely conversation. And I want to walk you through, we have this document, I don't know, I just pulled it up because I think it might be useful. I'm going to drop it into the chat. We have a document that sort of walks through designing a gender action plan for an investment fund, right? And so, you know, for what it's worth of the ways to look at finance. So I just want to walk through a couple of these elements and have you think about, how does this connect, right? Because the thing I'm struck with is, if that's what's necessary, and over here is how finance looks for objective truth and patterns and statistics that says we're moving in this direction, and how materially are the costs of gender-based violence going to affect my interests, right? Those are such different conversations than what we're having today. Like, if I just think about last night, we were talking about mega trends, and how do you think about gender-based violence as a mega trend, and what are the patterns you would track, and how do you look at this, and what sectors would it influence? Like, that's the conversation that we're having in finance. And I just love this point of having two separate conversations and seeing then how do they merge. So I just want to walk through, for lack of a better window into how finance works. Can you all get to this document? Should be a Word document opening up. So the first bit, and this is where I thought we were going to focus, but I could be wrong. It's wrong so often, which is looking at the investment thesis. So just this second page says, an investment thesis states how investor values the market over time. And this literally drives most decision making. So where an investor believes trends will lead over time, and then how you allocate capital now, both in one way to think about it is you take bets, you place bets today on what you think the future is. One of my favorite things about finance is once you take those bets and say, this is the future I think it is, I'm willing to take that bet. Once you take that bet, you, in the gambling language, double down on it, right? You keep making that same bet because you want to put more resources towards making your bet work, right? So if you think about how the internet started, right, there were lots of people who were starting to invest in the internet. And then they kept investing, and then they invest in the legal changes that were necessary to have their first investments work. And then they said, oh, we need platforms. So they invested in those platforms, and then we need, I don't know, they went on, right? They invested in a whole bunch of different things to actually make their initial investment work, right? The opposite of what we say right now, which is if people are really invested in the future rundown of all of the fossil fuels on the planet, they keep investing in making sure that they can run down the fossil fuels on the planet, right? And so let's invent more ways to extract fossil fuels because I'm doubling down on the bet that I've made. So from an investment thesis, one of the things I've put out there, and again, just the richness of this conversation, is one of the things that we keep putting out there is, what's your investment thesis if you believe that there is a change that's possible? If you have this future, how do you bet now to invest in that future? Any thoughts on that?
Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
I'm curious too, from your discussion last night, and I'm guessing the mega trends discussion involved a lot of the folks from the finance sector. I was curious if the discussion talked a bit about the impact of COVID-19 and the conditions that have been created as a result, and how those informed the projections or the thinking about mega trends. I ask because, you know, as we talked about in the U.S. context, there was a 65% drop in rates of intimate partner violence. Again, those are averages. So averages are always deceptive because if you disaggregate by race, but a 65% drop in rates of intimate partner violence prior to COVID-19. So of course, as we as activists and practitioners in the space of preventing domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence, think of our own mega trends and what needs to be done now, the investments that need to happen now to impact that future. Those scenarios have shifted, those thinking has shifted. I was just curious the extent to which that played a role in the discussion last night too. I'm curious to see if there's parallels there too.
Not directly. From my knowledge, it will be posted later today. It was a fascinating conversation. Not directly to my knowledge, to my memory. The core of the question was how to frame it right. Is gender-based violence the megatrend that we should be watching? And there's sort of, is that, it very, in some ways parallel to this conversation, is it that or factors of gender equality? Because the shift that actually matters is not, to address gender-based violence is not just having incidence numbers go down, because we all know that doesn't actually measure that much, right? The question is, except over time and all of that, as you're saying, Sarah, but that getting to the underlying shifts in gender norms, and that I'm going to refer you to that conversation because I think like the tying it back to this question of an investment thesis of, given that world that we were just describing of the process to get there is the change. And if an investor walked up to you and said, how should gender-based violence inform my investment thesis? what would you say? How should gender-based violence inform my picture of the future? Dunya?
So I'm again thinking about bringing the margin to the center and thinking about these women or men, but I'm particularly, when we're talking about COVID, I'm half Moroccan, and remembering all these women who pick strawberries, who all of a sudden there was a huge outbreak of COVID and they were all affected, and then it became very clear that they were all being abused on so many levels, which is happening all the time, and COVID is just shedding light on it. And so I'm thinking about the agricultural sector and all these genetically modified seeds and all these practices which are extremely extractive, that are very disempowering. These women who used to be able to have those communal lands, then work on communal lands, are now being extracted because of this like kind of move towards this these very extractive ways of doing agriculture. So I was just thinking, how do we reclaim the whole indigenous agricultural practices, or just like just the, and that's also being lost because the knowledge keepers are the elders who now their kids are going out. There's a rural exodus, and they go into the cities, and they're on they don't have the means because then there's no jobs, and then all of these conditions makes it so that you're so disempowered that you turn to violence, and you just don't see a better future. So it just feels like it's very connected to how do we invest in agricultural practices and seeds that are not genetically, like just practices that are respectful of the people cultivating the land and the land itself.
So it's not so much that you're looking specifically at gender-based violence. I'm sorry, there was something really cool in that, in terms of looking at the things that you believe are working but are connected to these other systems of power. Trying to say that right? Right, so you're investing in GMO seeds, but you're not recognizing that investing in that GMO is creating the social instability that's going to disrupt the market that you're actually trying to make some money in. Did I say that right?
Yeah. So I was looking for the same. Yeah, what's like proxies, things that that are huge leverage points, because this is where it's affecting the people who are going to be victims of gender-based violence directly. That's just one.
So other thoughts, really helpful. It's just maybe I'll couple other thoughts on, if you were talking to an investor who was coming up with their investment thesis, how would you tell them they should consider gender-based violence? Yeah.
Very interesting, Joy. I guess that comes to my mind.
Just lean all the way into your computer. Go back and lean all the way in.
Okay. I'm reminded of a case study in Kenya, how the women that were considered unbankable by international banks in 10 years ago changed the banking sector in Kenya. Women who make $1, $2, $3, $5 a day or 6 days a week changed the trajectory of the banking sector in Kenya when Equity Bank invested in them, opened for them accounts, to banking on the state, and the whole trajectory of the banking sector in Kenya changed. So my answer would be, take resources to the ones that are less, valuable, less important, the ones who nobody trusts with resources and money, but are the most resilient, who are holding the Kenyan economy today, because they're the ones who are selling food, buying food, holding families and households together. And two, put resources at the grassroots development level, where nobody else has gone, where resources are still untapped, where humanity is still genuine, honest, and real, where women, those ones illiterate and without education, are the ones who will most suffer gender-based violence.
So very similar in terms of they move the margins to the center, right? Take those most grassroots, most outside of the system and have that be what comes into the center. Did I hear that right? Yeah. Sarah?
I totally agree with everything that's been said. So just to add kind of affirmation and support for that, I totally agree. Just a few quick thoughts. I was talking to an investor, Joe, you mentioned rates of inequalities or inequities and gender inequities. I would also say that gender-based violence is an indicator for investors that directly correlates more than any other factor to market instability. It's Valerie Hudson's work that rates of gender-based violence are more predictive than rates of democracy, than disparities. It is the most directly correlated to market instability. So to me, that's very material to investors. But I think also it's what vision do they have for the future, right? Is it solely maximizing profits and money for them, or is there an and statement to what future they want to see? But I think as an investor in terms of social justice and social capital, I think the investments now that will bring about that future without violence have to do with addressing intergenerational trauma, about shifting, again, a system that's punitive to a system that's healing. And then that point about whole women, whole kids, whole families, that all of these sectors, housing insecurity, food insecurity, racial justice, all of these things are at the center, and those things coming together for families are critical to bring about that future. And those have market implications, right? Like housing, food insecurity, all these things, and economic justice. So those things coming together in an investment portfolio and driving change there are directly related to bringing about a future without gender-based violence.
Mm-hmm. 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 Celine, I can watch your brain. She's like, you got this wonderful forehead. Celine, what are you thinking?
No, I don't think I have other brilliant ideas than what we heard. I was thinking of the connection, something that Dunya said at some point about the emotional intelligence and the caring, and I think there is a strong connection about between climate change and betting on the future climate change finance, finance related to climate change, and our topic of today. But I don't know how to phrase it. But I think there is in this caring stuff, or to put it in another way, that the domination, the non-respect, the violence that is done to the earth are the same kind of violence as the one what could be compared to the same approach of this violence to mainly women and children. So I don't know if there would be a way of interesting the finance people in the same way as we do with what will happen with climate change. We could have a parallel approach.
Yeah, welcome, Brittany. Just I'll let you just kind of ease your way into this fascinating conversation. Welcome to How Would We Invest in a Future Without Gender-Based Violence? We have no idea. We get some actually really cool ideas, but so I'm putting together two things that I think are consistent here. So if I'm talking to an investor, Sarah, what you are really honing in on is, are your investments resting on the instability of inequality? Right? Like that is the kind of, at some fundamental level, these systems of inequality are driving instability more than anybody's counting, right? So it's not really about gender-based violence, although gender-based violence is a key indicator of whether or not the sort of inequalities and the sort of gender norms that and other norms, race and others that sort of keep those things in place. Or keep that instability in place, rather than saying it's about keeping the power in place. It's also about the instability in the center. And then, Rose, I'm taking the second idea of, I would love to get a room full of investors in the room together and say, if you imagined the margins at the center, how would your world look different? Right? We're working on a project in Southeast Asia that is ostensibly about the circular economy. But our role is to make sure that actually grassroots women's rights organizations and civil society organizations working on gender and other forms of injustice are in that conversation, because particularly in Southeast Asia, the circular economy and the reduction of plastics directly runs into the waste pickers. And that's sort of a massive system of inequality that is who actually manages the trash, who profits from it, who loses from it. And it is a system, as I'm sure many of you know, that's just rife with gender-based violence, right? So this kind of, I sit in some of these conversations with investors, and it's like they're building these beautiful plastic processing plants that are just going to clean it all up and get the plastic out of the ocean, but there's all the people just have to disappear first, right? But if we imagine, how would you think about how you invested in a processing plant around ocean plastics if the margins were the center, not the sort of the sort of rows, just really building on what you were saying, that not out to the edge. And I think, Celine, the question that you raised of like, well, you asked this question of what we get them to care about it. And I will say, honestly, it'd be so fascinating for you to watch this conversation last night, because super smart, really like well-intentioned, and not just well-intentioned in a like a condescending way, but like some of the people most trying to bring values to finance were on this call last night. They're not disingenuous. They're not just out for their own profit. Like, they are really trying to figure out how to change this system. But if I said to them, what I want you to consider is gender norms need to be upheld. The whole system has to be upended for this to work. You have to put the margins in the center. They say, give me an indicator that I can put in my spreadsheet, because I don't know how to do it otherwise, right? So there is a kind of, how do we translate that back to the system of finance and how it thinks now? But I want to raise one other possibility, and which is a conversation that we've had with philanthropists and donor governments, which asks, how would you invest your financial capital if you believed your philanthropy and your overseas development assistance was working? So the reason I'm tying this together, right, is we often make the case, because a powerful group is the sort of philanthropists and others, the people who have assets, who are asking their advisors to create something different for them. And this kind of imagination of, are your investments resting on the instability of inequality, is a conversation that's happening among asset holders. But the sort of, what do we do with that? So how would you invest? How would you create an investment thesis for where you want to put your capital if you believed your philanthropy was actually working? Rachel, you came off mute for that one. You want to take a stab at it?
I've just been doing some work on the future of work and looking at like trends like automation and things like that, and the impact that could have on health. And it's just conversations just making me think about like, and then people who are thinking about like, what are the skills? What will humans, still be valued for in our robot future? And so your question is like just making me, the things we will be valued for are the like creativity, care, like all these things that presumably robots can't do. So it makes me think about human development as really being the engine of the economy and all these sort of, and if we are traumatized, it's like the fundamental work we will be capable of doing that robots can't do, we can't do if we're not full. Like if we're not fully emotionally whole, if we're not, you know, fully creative and all of that. So like that is actually, if we think about that could be an interesting, and then of course, just my bias is like, I think about women, right? And their ability to connect, their ability to create, quite literally, you know, and so that makes me think like, is there something there? Like if we look at, when you were talking about the plastics plant, you know, I was like, who's doing the plastics plant? Like, is that machines or is that humans? And then I thought like, okay, but what is the work of the humans now?
Right.
And what will, if our role shifts, you know, in this machine-oriented world, yeah, I'll stop talking. But that was coming to mind as like, if we're not emotionally safe, if we're not whole, we won't be able to do our future work of, you know, fundamentally human.
Interesting.
Thank you, Rachel. For underlining how important this emotional work is at all levels of society. And Joy, I want to, when you were talking about the indicators in the conversation yesterday, it's like, oh wait, if you don't give me an indicator or something, I don't know how to process. It's funny because yesterday I will share it here. I read a paper called a methodology for creating community-based indicators on gender equity that just came out this year. And it's really interesting because it's also based in Asia, and they went to the communities in Fiji and all of that. And the community itself came up with the indicators, which could be an interesting way of bringing the margins to the center. Because then the indicators that are being looked at by the investors are being collected and designed by the people who are going to be impacted. And so then I can trust it. So, and then we're bringing the margins at the center because then, yeah, so it just seems exciting possibility. Yeah, and I think that Rosalind had spoken to that those are the places where that emotional intelligence is still intact, where these ways of being in community are still native to how people interact. And so it seems like we can all benefit in the West from learning from these indicators that might emerge.
A couple, maybe 4 years ago, I was in Fiji and brought together a group of women's rights organizations to teach them about finance, because remarkably, and this is part of, as many of you know, a lot of Criterion's work is we spend a lot of time teaching people in finance how to think about gender. We don't spend nearly enough time actually talking to people who know gender and teaching them about finance, right? And we were working in the Pacific, funded by the Australian government, and we were spending all of this time teaching these investors to care about gender. And so we showed up for 4 days in Suva, and one of the remarkable things was it was one of the first times that anybody had stopped and explained the logic of finance to folks. They had learned how to do financial literacy and open a bank account, but not, here is what's driving these calculations that are shaping your national policy. And so in that, there's actually a video, and I I was trying to figure out last night how much came out of it, but one of the things that was most powerful is that group of women actually named the what if gender-based violence cut in half. That is where this question came from for us, is they were trying to imagine, trying to push that if their work worked, this is what the future would look like, and how could they talk to their governments about making a bet on that future as if it was possible, and then how would that attract investment capital. But I just remember the sort of connections between that group trying to figure out how would we look at our economy differently, and how could we convey that to the people who are making decisions about our future, with which, Rose, is so much about what you and Easter and Elias and others are doing. Celine, before you jump out, do you have final thoughts here, and then we'll sort of transition to that in general?
No, I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry I have to leave the call a bit before the end, but thanks a lot. It was very rich, and we'll see what are the next conversations. So thanks a lot, Joy, for the animation, and wishing you a very good weekend to all.
Well, you can figure out how to capture this for Matthew as he continues.
Yeah.
This. You can just say what we heard.
Gonna be a challenge.
Points. Well, and I do want to just name that where this sits within the arc of the conference is we're doing the right thing in this conversation. This is the first of your conversations at Convergence, not the action-oriented last step of how we put this all into place, right? Which is what's so cool about having this arc of not only 3 weeks, but a series of conversations. And so this is in the framing section, right? And so what we're wrestling with here is what we were intended to be wrestling with. Like, is thinking about the future of gender-based violence worth a framing? Because otherwise we could have spent the whole time having conversations about naming the future without gender-based violence and finally gone, well, is that the right way to think about it? Or should we be actually talking about how would we invest if we put the margins in the center? And maybe that's a better frame for talking about what we're doing. And so these, as we've done, 16 convergences over the years, this first framing conversations is just to kind of do that intellectual work of how do we think about this, right? Because so often we come into conversations with as I'm clear that I came into this one with sort of a sense of how things have been so changed by this conversation. I'll think about it for a long time, but sort of thinking about what are the frames that we come into conversations with, and how do we need to unpack them. Then the next conversations are more about strategy of like what would actually change finance, like what actually works. We didn't have to answer that in this conversation, and so we had a little more freedom. And then how do we turn that into specific design, and then out to what does it take to actually make sure those designs get implemented. So that's kind of the arc of Convergence. And so my question to you as a final reflection is, as you think about this conversation, what are you going to carry with you into that arc from this conversation, right? So what are we taking from this that will travel through that strategy, design, implementation arc?
It's a question to me or to all?
Oh, that was to all, but if you want to name it before
okay,
you
no, because I have to leave now because I will run. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Oh, sorry, we didn't mean to keep her in the room. I was just sort of moving on, but great. So what's your thoughts? What are you going to take from this conversation, Rose?
One thing that I am getting, especially from the last comment, and Sarah, I like what you've said, is that the language of finance is a big point for me here, especially looking at the comments about give me an indicator. Is maybe the women at the margin who every day go through gender-based violence may not know how to name an indicator, but they know what they have an experience of what that indicator looks like. Design with them in the process, design it with them together, work with them from the onset to the end. So that language is one thing that I'm getting away with today, even by other conversations. Could we have a language that brings the margins together? then we work from forward. We build the process together.
Right. I heard all of that. Did anybody have pieces that cut out? You're still cutting out a little bit, Rose, but that kind of, how do we design the indicator with the margins? It was so well said. But you're doing better, and you're on mute again. But you definitely hear it better than with the beginning of the call. So I am always grateful for any internet access in Kenya some days. So, hey.
It's digital inequality, guys. Bear with us. We are hanging in here. We will. I hope we stay to the end. So.
We'll have endless patience. Any other thoughts? What are you taking from here into the other conversation? Sierra, I'm so curious what's happening in that.
No, I'm just thinking, so we're actually holding an economic justice summit in a few weeks with the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Biden Institute. And we're having a lot of corporations coming to the table to kind of bridge that gap of their like knowledge of gender-based violence and, you know, their corporate world and policies. And so I'm kind of like connecting the dots on like how we can actually bridge that gap for them and language that actually, you know, kind of benefits them rather than, you know, I don't know, just kind of figuring out how to bridge that gap. And so I'm definitely thinking about how we can frame it to like for them to want to invest in this future, which could also benefit them as well.
That's making me actually wonder, what are the future conversations that we could actually work on how to do that? Because I think it's a huge challenge of like, how do you actually build those kinds of indicators? Like what do you actually do in that? Other than that, Rachel?
I was just thinking about how like women hold a lot of power in community, like of the indicators and the work to really like set the conditions in communities. And there's some of the work that we've seen on COVID too has, so like when people get like through some of these cash support funds, like what happens was what's happening, and many of them are like beneficiaries are women, but as soon as they get some of the money, they actually, and they get some sense of stability, they start looking at how to support people around them. So I was just thinking about like their multiplier kind of effect and that power of that to, I mean, unfortunately, it's sometimes collectively nobody gets ahead because you're always trying to help like the next person, you know, the family closest to you, and then you're sort of collectively struggling. But if we thought about a future without the kind of violence or inequity we had, like that would be pretty amazing creative power if you always sort of turn to if you're always turning to those around you, you know. And from a financial perspective, like if you have the resources, I don't know, like that could be the way of kind of getting out of an extractive model and into a generative model of growth, I guess, that's more communally, centered on community versus I feel like finance, which is the extractive, the individual, and men hold a lot of power in that world. So I'm just thinking about those two forms of power and like, how would we negotiate those? How do we negotiate that flow of power and its resources and what's valued?
What are you taking away, Sarah? Or taking into, you don't have to take away, you can take in.
Yeah, no, agreed. I think what I'm taking away or what I'm thinking about is just the how. So we talked about moving margins to the center, and Joy, you had talked about stakeholders like philanthropists, investors, or capital investors, asset investors. And just to use an example, you know, a project that we've been working on, for the initiative, we created the indicators based on community and survivor input. And we asked them, what would prevent domestic violence, the families pointed to housing security, food security, just basic things. And as we talked with philanthropists and investors, there was always values alignment of moving margins to the centers and fundamental agreement. And I think with socially responsible investors too, the same thing, values alignment. But when they thought about investing, they thought about accountability. Well, we're not a foundation, I'm not a philanthropist that invests in housing, I invest in domestic violence. Or I'm not a investor that invests in education, I'm an investor that, et cetera, et cetera. So the values alignment was there across them, but then the how they overcome that hurdle to see their indicators differently, driven by community and residents, was the hurdle, you know, and it was because they had an accountability to their stakeholders, whoever those are. So I guess where my head is more in the how, because we know we have a growing, or not a critical mass, but a growing amount of investors, whether it's asset investors or philanthropists, that are values aligned with moving the margins to the center. But then when they get into the weeds of how you do that and still stay accountable to their own stakeholders, that's where it gets harder to do. So that's where my head is at. And I think through this conference, maybe teasing that out a little more.
Brittany, you've got thoughts?
Yes, that really resonates with me. And I'm so sorry I joined this conversation late.
Well, you're happy you joined the conversation.
I'm so happy I joined. No, I'm so excited. I'm so excited for this conference. So that resonates because at GCC, we invest in gender-based violence innovation. I don't necessarily feel like I have to convince anybody at my workplace that that's a priority. That's really what we do. But the way that we consider our indicators and our impact, what you said, Sarah, just really resonated. You know, we're always measuring the health impact of the innovations that we invest in. So like, is there going to be a reduction in gender-based violence? That's hard to track. But is there going to be a change in knowledge or awareness or attitudes, and are we promoting helpful gender norms and these kinds of things? Our bar for health impact tends to be a little bit rigid sometimes because we have to report back to our stakeholders these certain metrics and language of lives saved and lives improved that the government of Canada really understands. But the way that you framed, you know, housing and food security as some of the biggest predictors or preventative mechanisms for preventing GBV, it just makes me think about how can I broaden the scope of the things that we invest in and how we frame our impact as GCC continues to make investments in GBV innovation.
There's actually one of the things that I was just thinking where I was designing the conversation on impact investing for next week, and one of the questions is how do we influence how impact investing designs innovation? Because in general, impact investing is spurring all of this innovation blind to lots of the things that we talked about today. One of the threads, Sarah, to the implementation point, and this maybe is another piece to take away here for myself anyway, which is we've been working and actually starting with a project with the Canadian government on process metrics. So almost always when impact investors talk about what they do, they name impact metrics, right? How many lives saved, how many blah, blah, blah. But for most feminist or any approach that actually looks at power, outcome metrics are manipulative and, you know, take the power. I mean, there's all kinds of them that are actually naming outcome metrics are themselves extractive, because you, person affected by the issue, tell me if I benefited you now. No, I need you to tell me, how did I benefit you? I need to report on this, right? And that in and of itself reinforces these extractive power dynamics. And so what we've been trying to develop are process metrics that would say, how are you investing differently? And how do you then, because you could design, it's actually easier to hold investment managers accountable for process for the Canadians than it is to hold them accountable for outcomes. Because the outcomes are 10 years down the line, but you can say, did you do the process differently? But we don't ask that. We say, do exactly the same thing and have different outcomes. And so that kind of, in about 5 of the design conversations over the next couple weeks, the outcome is actually a process metric of how would you name that you considered this issue and approach things differently. And I don't know, there might be some things from this conversation that end up in that thinking. Well, and it is, Rachel?
I was just going to tie that back to Sarah's comment about philanthropy. I mean, just as someone who works in a foundation, like, I feel like we're constantly trying to make that argument that, like, how we got there, how we do this is as important as what the outcome is. But there is, even in our culture, like a real,
right.
So what, like,
yeah. And I
did we
yeah.
this and like for long-term problems, like now I'm actually in a very live argument about the time horizon of change. Like, are we about change if we want to break a multi-generational cycle, like that's not going to happen in 2 to 5 years, So I think that time horizon question is really part of it too. If we had faith that we did it the process, if we change the process, like that's part of, anyway.
So exactly that. And it's got to be a both and, people are not going to give away their outcome indicators, but we could add a set of process indicators because they don't exist now. And they certainly don't say, did you move the margins to the center? And how can you prove that you did that materially in how you changed your processes? So with that, thank you so much for this conversation. And again, this is the framing ones. Other ones will feel more action oriented and what do we go do and how do we get stuff done? But we're at the beginning. So we get to just wrestle with a bunch of stuff. So thanks for wrestling with me this morning in a non-violent kind of feminine, but still
yeah.
Trying to tie that all together. All right. Take care and I'll see you all at the conference.
Thank
you,
you.
Joy. Good
Bye.
to meet everyone.
It's so nice meeting everyone as well.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.